My name is Anna. I'm in my late 30s, a wife, at least I was, a working professional, and a woman people tend to describe with words like steady, reasonable, low maintenance. I've learnt those words often mean something else: predictable, forgiving, easy to overlook. If you met me during the years this story took place, you probably wouldn't remember much about me afterward. I wasn't loud. I didn't express my emotions in public. I listened more than I spoke. I handled things. I kept life moving. And because of that, people assumed I was fine. They assumed I didn't need much. They assumed I would always adapt. This story is not about revenge. It's not about public humiliation, dramatic confrontations, or shouting matches that end with doors slammed. It's about something quieter than that, something far more common and far more dangerous when ignored. It's about what happens when the person everyone relies on is also the person no one thinks will ever leave. When my husband told me he needed space, he said it calmly, kindly even. He framed it as something personal, something reflective. No accusations, no anger, just a request for distance, for clarity, for time. I believed him, because I had no reason to. We had built a life on routines, shared responsibilities, and the assumption that honesty didn't need to be announced out loud. I didn't know then that he had already chosen a different version of his life. I didn't know that while I was respecting his need for space, he was already unpacking boxes somewhere else. I didn't know that the truth would arrive not through a confession, but through paperwork. Quiet, bureaucratic, impossible to argue with. I found out because our utility bill was forwarded to a new address. This is a story about emotional justice, but not the kind that explodes. It unfolds slowly, methodically. It's about realizing too late that your silence has been misinterpreted and deciding just once not to correct that misunderstanding. Over the next few chapters, I'll take you through what it felt like to be underestimated in your own marriage, how small dismissals become normal, how roles get assigned without consent, and how change doesn't always announce itself with rage. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. I'm telling this story because I promised myself I would tell it honestly, not to villainize, not to dramatize, but to document what quiet dominance actually looks like when it's earned, not performed. If you've ever been the person who held everything together while being quietly replaced, have you ever wondered when the shift really began? Before everything changed, I was known for being reliable. Not impressive, not extraordinary. Reliable. I was the person who remembered birthdays without reminders, who paid bills before due dates, who noticed when the fridge was running low, or when a conversation was about to turn tense and quietly redirected it. At work, I was the one managers trusted with complicated processes they didn't want to think about. At home, I was the one who kept our life smooth enough that no one had to ask how it worked, including my husband. To him, I was stability. And I don't say that with bitterness, at least not at first. Stability sounds like a compliment until you realize it often replaces curiosity. Once someone decides you are solid, they stop looking closely. They assume you'll always be there, functioning in the background, absorbing friction so they don't have to. Friends used to say we were a balanced couple. He was expressive, social, and ambitious. I was calm, grounded, and practical. What they really meant was that I filled the gaps. I translated emotions into plans. I turned chaos into schedules. I handled things quietly so no one had to notice the effort. And because I never complained loudly, it was assumed I wasn't affected deeply. At dinners, conversations flowed around me. I was included, but rarely centered. When decisions were made, vacations, financial priorities, social plans, my preferences were considered eventually, usually after everyone else had spoken. I told myself that was maturity, compromise, partnership. What I didn't realize then was how visibility slowly erodes when you are always agreeable. I became the person others described in summaries. She's fine with whatever. She doesn't mind. Anna's easy. Those sentences followed me everywhere, and I wore them like proof of emotional intelligence. Inside the marriage, this translated into something subtle. My husband didn't mistreat me. There were no explosive fights, no cruelty anyone could point to. Instead, there was a gradual assumption that my role was to support the structure, not to reshape it. He talked about his stress more than he asked about mine. His ambitions were temporary pressures. My needs were already handled. If I expressed discomfort, it was often met with reassurance instead of change. A calm explanation of why things were the way they were and why that made sense. I accepted that logic far longer than I should have. Looking back, I see how I was edited out of my own narrative, not aggressively, but efficiently. I handled logistics, finances, and emotional cleanup. I was trusted with responsibility but rarely invited into vulnerability. I was the safe place to land, not the place he looked toward. And because I was competent, composed, and quiet, no one worried about me. That's the part people misunderstand about invisibility. It doesn't come from being weak, it comes from being useful. Useful people are rarely asked if they're happy. They're asked if they're available. I was available. I was the wife who remembered to forward mail, update insurance, and maintain relationships with extended family. I was the one who smoothed over his bad moods with patience, who interpreted his silence as fatigue rather than distance. I believed that love, when mature, looked like steadiness. So when he later said he needed space, it didn't feel like a betrayal yet. It felt like another role adjustment, another way I could accommodate. Because that's who I was to them, the woman who adapts quietly. What I didn't know was that while I was being seen as constant, I was also being taken for granted. And once someone stops seeing you, it becomes very easy for them to imagine a life where you're simply not there. But that understanding came later. At that time, I still believed being indispensable meant being valued. I was wrong. The first moment I remember wasn't dramatic. That's why it stayed with me. It happened on an ordinary evening, one of those nights that never announces its importance. We were in the kitchen. I was rinsing dishes, still in work clothes, listening to him talk about a new project, a new colleague, a new kind of energy he felt at work. He was animated in a way I hadn't seen in months. At some point, I offered a suggestion. Nothing emotional, just a practical thought, the kind I had shared for years. I didn't interrupt him. I waited for a pause. He nodded, distracted, and said, "Yeah, maybe." Then he turned back to his phone. The conversation didn't stop. It just moved past me. That was the first small cut. Not because he disagreed with me, not because he was rude, but because of how easily my presence became optional. How natural it felt for him to continue without registering that I had spoken at all. A few minutes later, he repeated my exact suggestion, framed slightly differently, as if it had just occurred to him. And then he smiled, satisfied, energized by his own insight. I stood there, drying my hands on a towel, and waited for the moment when he'd realize what he'd done. It never came. He wasn't trying to hurt me. That's what made it so confusing. There was no malice to react against, no clear offense to name. If I brought it up, I'd sound petty, oversensitive. I could already hear the responses. "You're reading too much into it. It wasn't intentional." So I did what I'd always done. I let it go. But my body didn't. Something tightened in my chest. Not anger, not sadness, just awareness. A quiet note of a shift. Like the first crack in porcelain, you only see it when the light hits it at the right angle. After that, I started noticing similar moments. Small ones, easy to dismiss individually. He'd ask for my opinion, then look relieved when someone else confirmed it. He'd make plans without checking, then apologize lightly if they conflicted with mine. "I just assumed you'd be okay with it," he'd say, and I would nod, because I usually was. Other people didn't see it. Why would they? From the outside, we still looked functional, comfortable, even enviable. There was no screaming, no tension at parties, no obvious fractures. And I didn't want to be the woman who turned subtle discomfort into accusations. So I internalized it as a phase. Stress, fatigue, normal distance that long-term couples go through. I told myself that noticing too much could create problems where none existed. But the thing about small cuts is that they don't bleed. They mark. I remember one evening mentioning a book I was reading, something that had moved me deeply. He listened politely for about 30 seconds, then checked the time and said, "That's interesting," in a way that meant the conversation was over. Later that night, he spent an hour animatedly discussing a podcast episode with someone else. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse. I didn't even withdraw. I adjusted. I shared less. I observed more. I started storing moments instead of reacting to them. Not out of strategy, at least not consciously, but because reacting no longer felt useful. I told myself that love wasn't about keeping score, that long marriages required patience, that my role was to be stable, not sensitive. What I didn't realize then was that every time I minimized myself to keep the peace, I was teaching him something. I was teaching him that my absence would not cause disruption, and people rarely notice the value of something that never demands attention. The first small cut didn't hurt. It taught me something far more dangerous, that I could be overlooked without consequence. Or so he thought. Once you explain something away enough times, it starts to feel normal. That's how it happened. Not through a single betrayal, but through repetition. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't set off alarms because it arrives disguised as everyday life. After that first small cut, I became very good at reinterpretation. I reframed moments before they could settle into meaning. If he forgot to tell me about a change of plans, I told myself he was busy. If he dismissed my concern with a quick solution, instead of listening, I called it efficiency. If he grew impatient when I needed reassurance, I reminded myself that everyone has limits. I became fluent in excuses that protected the relationship at my own expense. And because I didn't raise my voice or draw lines in the sand, the pattern deepened. He started assuming agreement before I spoke. Decisions would be presented as conclusions, not conversations. I already told them yes, he'd say, surprised only when I hesitated. I didn't think you'd mind. That phrase, I didn't think you'd mind, became a kind of punctuation in our marriage. It ended discussions before they could begin. It framed my discomfort as an exception rather than a signal. When I did push back gently, the response was always reasonable. He wasn't dismissive, he was calm. Calm enough that questioning him felt unnecessary, even irrational. You're overthinking it, he'd say, not unkindly. You know I appreciate you. This isn't about you. And because nothing was ever about me, I learned to step aside. I told myself that love meant choosing harmony over ego, that my quiet nature was a strength, not something to defend. I watched other couples fight loudly and promised myself I'd never become like that. But silence has a way of becoming misinterpreted. The more I absorbed, the more he expanded. His schedule is filled, his emotional bandwidth narrowed. I adjusted mine to compensate. I handled more at home so he could focus on work. I made space so he could breathe. And gradually my needs stopped registering as needs at all. What troubled me most wasn't that he stopped asking how I felt. It was that when he did ask, he didn't really wait for the answer. The question became a formality, a polite pause before returning to his own concerns. I noticed how my words landed and slid off without impact, how my presence felt interchangeable with the role I played. Wife, organizer, emotional stabilizer. At some point, I realized I was managing his comfort more carefully than my own truth. Still, I stayed quiet, because nothing felt bad enough. That's the trap of normalized disrespect. It rarely arrives as cruelty. It arrives as an imbalance that feels too mild to protest and too persistent to ignore. I told myself stories to make it bearable. Those relationships evolve. Those phases pass. That loyalty means endurance. I told myself that if I just remained steady, we would find our way back. But steadiness without boundaries doesn't create closeness. It creates permission. Permission to overlook, permission to assume, permission to take without checking. I remember lying awake one night, listening to him type on his phone beside me, his attention fully elsewhere. I wanted to say something, anything, that would pull him back into the room, but I didn't want to beg for presence. I didn't want to compete for it. So I stayed still. That was the moment I realized something had shifted inside me. Not anger, not resentment, something quieter. Resignation. And resignation is dangerous, because it looks like peace from the outside. I had become so skilled at adapting that he stopped noticing adaptation was happening at all. My silence had trained him, not intentionally but effectively. But by the time I sensed something was wrong, the pattern felt established, stable, unquestioned. Disrespect had been normalized not because he demanded it, but because I absorbed it. And the more I absorbed, the less visible I became. I didn't know then that this invisibility would soon be mistaken for replaceability, but I was about to learn. Roles don't need to be announced to become permanent. They form quietly, through repetition and relief, through the unspoken agreement that one person will hold the weight so the other doesn't have to feel it. Somewhere along the way, my role solidified. I was the reliable one, the reasonable one, The woman who didn't complicate things with emotions that needed tending. I wasn't dramatic, I wasn't demanding, I didn't require checking in, and because of that, I became the background infrastructure of our life, the part that only mattered when it failed. I saw it most clearly in how problems were rooted. If something went wrong at work, he came to me for grounding. If he felt overwhelmed, I helped him think through solutions. If there was conflict elsewhere, I was the sounding board. But when I was unsettled, the expectation was subtle but firm. I would handle it myself. Not because he didn't care, but because he trusted me to manage. Trust in this context became a way of opting out. I noticed how his tone shifted depending on what he needed. When he wanted support, his voice softened. When I wanted space to speak, it became practical, efficient, and wrapped in reassurance. The message was always the same. You're strong, you'll be fine. And I had reinforced that message myself. I rarely cried in front of him. I chose my words carefully. I didn't interrupt. I didn't insist. I presented concerns like bullet points, clear, calm, solvable. I wanted to be taken seriously, not emotionally discounted. What I didn't realize was that by removing urgency from my feelings, I was removing their weight. I became the partner who could be leaned on without leaning back. The one whose inner world didn't need exploration because it never caused friction. That role extended beyond our marriage. Friends called me the level-headed one. Family members praised my patience. Even strangers sensed it. A certain containment, a way of not asking to be held. And so I wasn't. I was assigned the role of emotional self-sufficiency. At first, I wore it with pride. There's validation in being seen as capable, in being the person who doesn't unravel when things get difficult. But capability without reciprocity slowly hollows you out. I remember sitting across from him one evening while he talked about feeling misunderstood at work. I listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and mirrored his feelings back to him. I could see him relax as he spoke, lighter, steadier by the end. When he finished, there was a pause, a natural opening. I began to speak. He glanced at his phone. Not in a rude way, just a reflex, a habit. And in that moment, I understood my role completely. I was there to receive, not to reveal. To stabilize, not to disrupt. To support the story, not to be the story. It wasn't that he thought my inner life was unimportant. It was that the structure of our relationship no longer made room for it. There was no space allocated, no time budgeted. And because I didn't demand that space, it stayed empty. Roles are powerful because they simplify relationships. They reduce complexity. They allow people to move efficiently without renegotiating expectations. But they also freeze you in place. By the time I realized I had been assigned a part I never auditioned for, the script was already familiar to everyone else. Reliable, calm, low maintenance, invisible. And invisibility, once accepted, is very hard to reverse. I didn't know yet that I would eventually step out of that role. I only knew that something in me had grown quiet, not with peace but with watchfulness. I was no longer trying to be seen. I was beginning to see. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation that forced clarity into the open. In fact, nothing outward changed at all. That's what made it unmistakable. It was a Tuesday morning. Ordinary in every way that matters until it doesn't. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee, reviewing my planner before work. He was already dressed, moving around the apartment with that distant efficiency I'd come to associate with distraction. He told me, casually, almost thoughtfully, that he felt like he'd lost himself lately. The words were soft, carefully chosen. The kind of sentence that asks for understanding before it asks for anything else. "I think I need some space," he said. "Just to think, to breathe. It's not about you." I remember nodding. Not because I fully understood, but because I recognized the pattern. This was another situation where my role was to respond calmly, to make things easier. I told him I understood. I said we could figure it out. And then something unexpected happened inside me. There was no panic, no rush to fix, no instinct to reassure him that I'd wait, that I'd adjust, that I'd be here no matter what. Those instincts had gone quiet. Instead, I felt a stillness, a kind of internal pause I hadn't experienced before, as if some part of me had stepped back and started observing the moment rather than participating in it. He continued talking about pressure, about needing clarity, about how this didn't change how he felt about me. I listened, but not the way I used to. I wasn't translating his words into action items. I wasn't scanning for emotional cues to respond to. I was noticing something else. How carefully he avoided specifics. How space came without a timeline. How his relief was visible the moment I didn't push back. When he left that morning, he kissed my cheek out of habit. The door closed. The apartment went quiet. And for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like information. I sat there longer than necessary, coffee cooling in my hands, and let the moment settle. There was a faint sadness, yes, but underneath it, clarity. Clarity. I realized I had spent years maintaining equilibrium without ever asking whether the balance made sense. That morning, I didn't cry. I didn't call a friend. I didn't journal or replay the conversation, looking for reassurance. I simply noticed that my first instinct was no longer to shrink myself to keep him comfortable. That was new. At work that day, I functioned normally. No one noticed anything different, but internally, a line had been crossed. Not dramatically, but definitively. I stopped explaining his behavior to myself. I stopped assuming my silence was neutral. I began to understand that space, when requested by one person alone, often creates room for truths the other hasn't been invited into yet. That evening, I opened my planner and started writing things down. Not emotions, facts, dates, statements, small details I might otherwise forget. I didn't know why I was doing it. I only knew it felt necessary. The shift wasn't toward confrontation. It was toward the agency. I realized that clarity didn't require his participation, that understanding my situation didn't depend on his explanations, that waiting quietly didn't have to mean being unprepared. That was the day something changed. Not in the marriage, in me. After he asked for space, my silence changed texture. Before it had been reactive, an instinct to preserve harmony, to avoid friction. Now it was deliberate, measured, chosen. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't explain it to anyone. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still responded politely. I still handled logistics. I still asked how his day was when our paths crossed. But internally, I had stopped filling in gaps. When he didn't explain where he was going, I didn't ask. When he grew vague about timelines, I didn't clarify. When days passed without meaningful conversation, I didn't rush to repair the distance. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't a test. It was an observation. Silence, I learned, reveals patterns far more accurately than confrontation ever had. Without my usual adjustments, things became clearer. His absences lengthened. His calls grew more scheduled than spontaneous. When we did speak, his tone carried relief, as if my lack of questions made everything easier. And that told me everything I needed to know. He mistook my quiet for compliance. That misunderstanding gave me room. I began paying attention to what he assumed versus what he confirmed. He assumed I was okay. He assumed I was waiting. He assumed I trusted him implicitly. I confirmed nothing. Instead, I gathered information in the background of my life. Not obsessively, calmly, methodically, the same way I approached complex systems at work. I noticed when he stopped using we in casual conversation, when future plans became abstract, when his belongings subtly thinned out, an extra jacket gone, a pair of shoes missing. Still, I said nothing, because silence, when chosen, is not emptiness, it's capacity. Friends asked how things were. I said we were taking space. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't recruit opinions. I wasn't looking for reassurance. I was watching, and the more I watched, the more I realized how much effort I had been exerting before to keep the narrative intact. Without that effort, the story changed on its own. One evening, he mentioned he might stay with a friend for a bit. He said it lightly, as if the phrasing itself would keep it unexamined. I nodded. No follow-up questions, no concern. I saw the surprise flicker across his face, quick, almost imperceptible, then relief. That was the moment I understood the power of restraint. Silence had shifted from something done to me into something I wielded. I didn't need answers yet. I needed accuracy. Accuracy comes when people are comfortable enough to reveal themselves. And he was comfortable. He didn't see the planner on my nightstand filling with notes. He didn't know I was paying closer attention than ever. He didn't realize that every assumption he made in my silence was becoming data. This wasn't about catching him. It was about seeing the full shape of my reality without distortion. I learned that people often tell the truth most clearly when they think they don't have to explain themselves. And in those weeks of chosen quiet, he told me everything, without realizing he was speaking at all. What people misunderstand about quiet people is that silence doesn't mean stillness. While he believed nothing was happening, because I wasn't reacting, questioning, or demanding, preparation had already begun. Not in a dramatic way, in the way I'd always done things, thoroughly, invisibly, without announcement. He never noticed because he didn't expect me to move without permission. My days looked the same from the outside. I went to work, I answered messages, I handled responsibilities, but internally, I had shifted into a different mode, one I recognized from moments in my life when clarity mattered more than comfort. I started by grounding myself in facts, not assumptions, not interpretations, facts. I reviewed our finances the way I would review a system at work, line by line, without emotion. Accounts, automatic payments, insurance policies, utilities, subscriptions, anything that linked our lives together in ways that could later become leverage or liability. I didn't change anything yet, I just mapped it. I noticed which bills were in my name, which were joint, which he managed, and which I had quietly taken responsibility for years ago because it was easier that way. It had been easier, until it wasn't. I began documenting timelines, when he asked for space, when he stayed away overnight, when plans were postponed without rescheduling. I didn't label these entries with feelings. I labeled them with dates. Clarity loves documentation. At work, I'd learned that the person who controls the record controls the narrative. And I had been keeping records my entire adult life. I had just never applied that skill to my marriage. I also started noticing something else. No one checked on me. Friends assumed I was fine because I sounded fine. Family members took my calm tone as reassurance. Even though he never asked how I was managing the space he requested, they all believed I was enduring. They never considered that I might be repositioning. In the evenings, I read. Not self-help books, practical ones, financial literacy, legal frameworks, not with the intention to act immediately, but to understand my options. Understanding is power that doesn't announce itself. I learned how shared assets are interpreted when timelines shift. How intent is inferred from behavior rather than declarations. How quiet consistency carries weight when things are later questioned. None of this felt vengeful. It felt adult. What struck me most was how invisible this preparation was. Because I didn't change my tone or demeanor, no one suspected a shift. People associate action with noise. They look for raised voices, emotional speeches, and ultimatums. I gave none of that. He continued assuming my silence meant patience, that I was waiting for him to figure things out, that I would adapt, as I always had. And I let him, because assumptions, when left uncorrected, often work in your favor. There was a strange calm in those weeks, not happiness, but steadiness. For the first time, my energy wasn't being spent maintaining an image of harmony. It was being invested in accuracy. I wasn't trying to save the relationship. I was trying to see it clearly. And clarity has a way of changing what you're willing to tolerate. The most important thing they never noticed was this. I had stopped imagining a future that required their cooperation. I began imagining one that only required my consent. That shift didn't show on my face. It didn't change my routine. It didn't provoke questions. But it changed everything. Because once you stop needing someone to choose you, you're free to choose yourself. Quietly, carefully, and without asking permission. The truth didn't arrive with drama. No confrontation. No accidental confession. No moment where everything suddenly made sense in a rush of emotion. It arrived folded inside an envelope. A utility bill. I remember the exact moment because of how unremarkable it should have been. I was sorting mail at the kitchen counter, the way I always did. Most of it was routine, bank statements, notices I recognized instantly. Then there was one envelope that felt wrong. Same company, same account, different address. At first, my mind tried to correct it. A clerical error, a system update, something boring and fixable. I stood there longer than necessary, reading the new address again and again, letting the letters arrange themselves into certainty. It wasn't a friend's place. It wasn't temporary housing. It wasn't a mistake. It was a home. One he hadn't mentioned, one he hadn't hesitated to set up utilities for, one that required intention, planning, and permanence. I didn't sit down. I didn't feel dizzy. I didn't cry. I felt still. This was the moment where everything aligned, not emotionally, but structurally. The missing shoes, the vague timelines, the comfort he found in my silence, the way he framed space as reflection rather than relocation. He hadn't been drifting. He had already arrived somewhere else. What struck me most was not the betrayal itself, but the efficiency of it. How neatly my role had been managed while a parallel life was established. How my calm had been interpreted as consent to be excluded from the truth. I didn't call him. I didn't text. I didn't confront the address with questions it didn't owe me answers to. Instead, I placed the bill on my desk and opened my planner. I wrote down the date, the company name, the forwarding notice. Then I closed the planner. There was no satisfaction in being right, no vindication, just clarity. The private reveal is rarely about shock. It's about confirmation. Everything I had been observing quietly now had a center of gravity. The facts no longer floated, they aligned. I realized then that the woman he was with wasn't the point. She was part of a decision he had already made. To move forward without transparency, trusting that my restraint would protect him from consequence. And for a long time it had. That night, when he came by to pick up more of his things, he spoke casually. He mentioned work. He thanked me for being understanding. He said he was glad we could handle this like adults. I watched him move through the apartment, comfortable in the assumption that I knew less than I did. I didn't correct him, because the moment you reveal what you know, you lose the advantage of timing. I wasn't angry. I was precise. This wasn't the moment to react. It was the moment to decide what kind of ending I was willing to live with. The private reveal didn't make me stronger. It didn't transform me. It clarified the ground I was standing on. And from solid ground, you don't rush. You choose. Once you know the truth, there's a moment where everything goes quiet. Not outside, but inside. That's the decision point. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with certainty or confidence. It arrives as a pause where all the available paths lay themselves out in front of you. Equally real, equally possible. I could confront him immediately, lay the bill on the table, ask the questions he had carefully avoided answering, demand honesty now that I have proof. I could cry, I could rage, I could insist on explanations that would only be shaped by damage control. I could also do what I had always done. Absorb it, minimize it. Tell myself that clarity was enough and that dignity meant not disrupting anyone else's comfort. Each option was familiar. Each one fit the version of me that everyone expected. But there was one option that felt unfamiliar, and therefore honest. I could choose irreversibility. Not in a dramatic sense, not with declarations or threats, but by making decisions that quietly assumed the marriage was already over, regardless of whether he was ready to say it out loud. That choice required something I hadn't needed before. Trust in my own timing. I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. Not what do I want him to do, but what am I no longer willing to explain away? The answer came easily. I was no longer willing to participate in a story where my role was to make his transition painless. I didn't need to expose him. I didn't need validation from others. I didn't need to be seen as right. I needed control over what happened next, so I made a decision that night, not to confront but to proceed. I would act as though the truth I knew was sufficient, as though his explanations were no longer required for my next steps to be justified. This was not about punishment. It was about alignment. I understood then that waiting for him to be honest would keep me anchored to his timeline, and his timeline had already excluded me. Choosing irreversibility meant doing things that couldn't be undone quietly later, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. It meant preparing for separation without announcing it. It meant shifting my life in ways that assumed continuity with myself, not with him. It also meant accepting something difficult, that the calmest path forward might look cold to people who didn't know the full context. I made peace with that, because clarity doesn't always look compassionate to those who benefited from your silence. The decision point wasn't about whether the marriage could be saved. It was about whether I would continue negotiating my worth with someone who had already moved on. That night, I slept deeply, not because I felt resolved, but because I had stopped arguing with reality. And once you stop arguing with what is, everything that follows becomes remarkably straightforward. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. Not because I hesitated, but because I no longer needed urgency. Urgency is what you feel when you're still hoping someone else will change the outcome. I wasn't. I began moving through my days with a different kind of focus. Calm, methodical, almost detached. From the outside, it looked like nothing was happening. Inside, things were aligning. The first changes were administrative. Quiet. Boring. Exactly the kind no one pays attention to. I reviewed documents I hadn't touched in years. I made copies. I updated the records. I checked dates. I ensured that anything with my name on it accurately reflected my involvement, and anything that didn't, I made note of. I didn't confront him about finances. I didn't accuse him of hiding things. I didn't change my tone or behavior. I simply stopped carrying weight that wasn't mine to carry. When bills came due, I paid the ones I was responsible for and documented the rest. When questions arose, I answered plainly. No elaboration, no reassurance layered on top. He mistook my neutrality for trust. That misunderstanding continued to work in my favor. I also began creating physical space, not by removing his things, but by reclaiming mine. Items I'd lent out of convenience returned quietly to their places. Files I'd organized for us were reorganized for me. It wasn't emotional. It was structural. At work, I requested a schedule adjustment, not framed around personal issues, just a recalibration of priorities. I didn't explain more than necessary. I didn't ask for permission to protect my energy. People respected clarity when it arrived without drama. Friends noticed I was less available. Not withdrawn, just selective. I didn't fill the silence with updates or justification. I let conversations remain surface level when that was all they could support. I was no longer seeking witnesses. I was building continuity. The most difficult part wasn't the logistics, it was resisting the urge to reveal what I knew. There's a strange temptation in holding truth that could upend someone else's sense of control. But I reminded myself, exposure is only powerful when you need a reaction. I didn't. My power was in timing, so I waited. I let him continue under the assumption that the status quo remained intact, that we were in a temporary phase, that I was still accommodating. That belief made him careless. And carelessness is informative. The silence I maintained wasn't passive. It was disciplined. I didn't vent. I didn't hint. I didn't signal shifts emotionally. I moved in silence because silence preserved optionality. By the time any change became visible from the outside, it would already be irreversible. That was the point. I wasn't disappearing. I was repositioning. And he wouldn't realize it until the ground beneath him no longer responded the way it used to. Consequences rarely announce themselves when they begin. They don't arrive as confrontations or ultimatums. They arrive as small disruptions, moments where something no longer works the way it used to, and no one can immediately explain why. That's how it started. He mentioned, casually, that something with an account had been delayed. Not frustrated, just confused. I told him I wasn't managing that anymore. My tone was neutral, factual, no edge. Oh, he said, a pause, okay. It didn't seem important to him then. A few days later, he asked if I'd seen a document he needed. I told him where it was, where it had always been. He sounded surprised. You used to handle that. I don't anymore, I said. Still no reaction. At first, the consequences were invisible because they didn't look like losses. They looked like inconveniences. Minor adjustments he assumed were temporary. But the pattern continued. Things he relied on began requiring his attention. Follow-ups he'd never tracked before landed squarely in his lap. Decisions that once passed through me now stopped entirely, unless he initiated them himself. I hadn't withdrawn support abruptly. I had simply stopped compensating. That distinction matters. The world didn't fall apart. Nothing dramatic happened, but a subtle friction entered his life, one he couldn't quite name. I noticed it in his tone when he called. Less relaxed, slightly distracted. He began asking questions he'd never asked before. Not about us, but about processes, timelines, responsibilities. He was feeling the absence of invisible labor. Still, he didn't connect it to me, because from his perspective, I was still calm, still polite, still handling things. Just fewer things. Friends started noticing changes too, not in me, but in him. He seemed more scattered, less sure. He talked about being overwhelmed without understanding why. I listened without offering solutions. That was new. The consequences weren't punitive. They were natural. They emerged from reality, finally being allowed to function without my constant intervention. And reality, it turns out, is very honest. I saw the shift most clearly one evening when he said, I didn't realize how much you did. It wasn't an apology. It was an observation. Delayed, incomplete, and oddly detached. I nodded. Not because it was enough, but because it was too late to matter. By the time people notice the absence of something essential, it's usually because they assumed it would always be there. That assumption had been doing a lot of work for him. Now it wasn't. I didn't correct him. I didn't explain what he'd missed. I didn't list contributions or sacrifices. Understanding earned under pressure is rarely durable. Instead, I let the consequences continue their quiet work, because the most powerful shifts don't require force. They require removal. Panic doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like sudden attentiveness, a belated curiosity, questions that arrive too late and linger too long, hoping to reverse momentum that's already past the point of return. That's what happened next. He started checking in more often, not consistently, but noticeably. Messages that asked how my day was, followed by long gaps. Invitations framed as nostalgia. Do you remember when we used to? Statements that hovered near accountability without quite landing there. I've been thinking a lot, he said once. I didn't handle things perfectly, he said another time. They sounded like progress. To someone still waiting, they might have been enough. But I wasn't waiting anymore. What he didn't understand was that the moment for repair had existed earlier, quietly, invisibly, when honesty would have changed the trajectory. That moment had passed without recognition. Now his concern felt reactive. He noticed that I no longer filled the silence with reassurance, that I didn't smooth his discomfort or translate his uncertainty into hope. He noticed that I wasn't asking questions about his life anymore. Absence once established is unsettling. He asked if I was angry. I said no, and that unsettled him more than anger would have. Because anger implies engagement. It means you still care enough to want something to change. I had moved beyond that stage without announcement. He suggested we talk things through. He used the language of collaboration, as if the delay itself could be reframed as a misunderstanding, rather than a decision. I listened, and for the first time, I heard not reflection, but fear. Fear of loss, fear of disruption, fear of being seen clearly after having been careless. What he wanted wasn't reconciliation. It was relief. Relief from the consequences of a choice he hadn't expected to fully land. I could see him trying to re-enter a role he had already vacated. Tentatively, uncertain of the rules. He didn't realize the structure had changed because it hadn't changed loudly. That's the thing about quiet exits. They're invisible until the door no longer opens. He asked what I wanted. The question came late, and without preparation for the answer. I want consistency, I said. Clarity, I added. Not explanations. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't understand the difference. Explanations would have helped him earlier, when they could have guided his behavior. Now, they were just stories. Stories don't reverse consequences. By the time he realized I wasn't negotiating, his tone changed. There was urgency now, a desire to fix things, to revisit assumptions, to redefine space. But space, once occupied by someone else, doesn't reset just because regret arrives. He was responding to loss, not to insight. An insight can't be rushed into existence. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my position. I didn't escalate. I simply stayed aligned with what I had already decided. It wasn't cruel. It was final. Because by the time someone asks what they can do to fix it, the person who needed fixing things for them has already moved on. The confrontation happened without raised voices. No slammed doors. No accusations flung across the room. It was almost disappointingly calm, so calm that anyone listening from the outside might have mistaken it for closure. We sat at the table where we had once planned vacations and budgets. The same chairs, the same light is coming through the window. He spoke first. He admitted he had moved in with someone else. Not defensively, not proudly, just factually, as if saying it out loud might finally align the story. I didn't react. Not because it didn't matter, but because I already knew. I told him I'd seen the forwarded utility bill. That was the only new information in the room. For a moment, he looked unsettled. Not by the discovery itself, but by how little it seemed to change anything. I didn't ask why. I didn't ask how long. I didn't ask what it meant. Those questions belonged to a version of me that had needed reassurance. This version needed nothing further to proceed. I told him that I had made decisions based on what I observed, not on what he chose to explain later. He tried to soften it. He talked about confusion, about timing, about how things just happened. I listened without interruption. When he finished, there was a pause, one of those moments people fill with apologies or promises. I didn't. Instead, I said something simple. I don't want to be managed anymore. He looked at me, confused. I explained, not emotionally, but clearly, that I wasn't interested in navigating partial truths or delayed honesty. That trust, once fractured quietly, doesn't rebuild through discussion alone. He asked if there was anything he could do. That question came from habit. I answered with clarity. No, not sharply, not coldly, just accurately. There was no satisfaction in saying it, only relief. I told him I wished him well. I hoped he found what he was looking for, and that I would be proceeding with my own plans. I didn't justify them. I didn't seek agreement. I stood up. The conversation ended because there was nothing left to resolve. Confrontation without heat is unsettling to people who expect emotion to be leveraged. There was no leverage left to apply. What he faced in that moment wasn't my anger. It was my absence. And absence, when chosen, is definitive. After everything ended, people expected a transformation they could recognize. They looked for bitterness, for a dramatic reinvention, for visible proof that I had been hurt and survived it. What they didn't understand was that I hadn't been destroyed. I had been clarified. I didn't emerge louder. I didn't become harder. I didn't replace silence with performance. If anything, I became more selective with my words, more intentional with my presence. The difference was internal. I no longer explained myself into smaller shapes to be easier to accommodate. I no longer translate my needs into something palatable before honoring them. I stopped assuming that being calm meant being endlessly available. That shift changed everything. At work, I began occupying space without apology. Not aggressively, just fully. I spoke when I had something to say and didn't soften my statements to preempt discomfort. I trusted that clarity didn't require cushioning. People noticed, not because I demanded attention, but because I no longer disappeared. In relationships, I paid attention to reciprocity. Not in a transactional way, but in a grounded one. If someone listened, I shared. If they deflected, I adjusted my investment accordingly. I didn't chase depth with people who preferred convenience. That alone simplified my life. I also stopped mistaking endurance for virtue. Staying silent through discomfort isn't a strength when it erases you. Strength is knowing when to remain composed and when to move on without asking permission. The most surprising change was how peaceful my days became. Not joyful in an exaggerated sense, just steady, unburdened. I realized how much mental energy I had spent managing other people's perceptions of me, making sure I seemed understanding, making sure I wasn't too much. Now I let misunderstanding exist. Not everyone needs to understand you for your choices to be valid. I no longer define myself by how well I can stabilize others. I define myself by how aligned my life feels with my values. And those values are simple: honesty over comfort, consistency over charm, presence over performance. I don't regret loving deeply. I regret only the time I spent convincing myself that being overlooked was a sign of maturity. It wasn't. It was a signal I learned to read too late, but not too late to act on. Who I am now is not someone new. It's who I was before I learned to shrink. There's a particular kind of ending that doesn't feel like triumph or tragedy. It feels like alignment. That's what this was for me. Not a victory over someone else, not a lesson taught through humiliation or exposure. Just a quiet return to myself, without needing permission, without needing applause. For a long time, I believed that being patient, calm, and understanding would protect love. That if I stayed reasonable, if I didn't demand too much, if I absorbed discomfort without naming it, I was being mature. What I didn't understand was that silence, when it's automatic, teaches people how to treat you. And silence, when it's chosen, teaches you who you are. This story isn't about infidelity alone. Affairs are often the visible fracture, not the original fault line. The deeper break happened earlier, when I learned to minimize my needs to maintain peace, and when someone else learned that peace could be maintained without honesty. That dynamic doesn't end loudly. It ends when one person stops participating. The moral of this story isn't leave at the first sign of discomfort. It's not expose the truth at all costs. And it's certainly not win. The moral is simpler and harder. Pay attention to who your silence benefits. If your calm requires you to disappear, it isn't calm, it's erasure. And if someone only notices your value when you remove it, the lesson isn't for them. It's for you. I don't hate my former husband. I don't wish him harm. I don't need him to regret anything in order to move forward. What I needed was to stop negotiating my worth with someone who had already chosen a different life. That decision didn't require anger. It required clarity. If you're listening to this, and something feels familiar, the quiet adjustments, the overlooked contributions, the sense that you're holding everything together while slowly being edged out, this isn't a call to confront. It's an invitation to observe, to document, to pause, to ask yourself where you're still being silent out of habit rather than choice, and then to decide, on your own timeline, what alignment looks like for you. So I'll end with this question. And I genuinely want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized that your silence was being mistaken for consent? And what did you do when you finally saw it?
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.